I wanted to take a few minutes and share some of my thoughts as to what's currently happening in the world economy. I won't be using any charts or graphs this time. This will simply be a verbal discussion. In my industry, I'm seeing some harbingers of very bad times on the way. My industry is in the chemical sector, and my company produces feedstocks, which are very important in the production of steel, glass, cement, liquid fuels, plastics, fertilizers, food and beverage, non-ferrous metals, and pulp and paper, to name a few. In a way, you could say that I get a front row seat when it comes to seeing what's going on in the world manufacturing space. Almost all manufacturing sectors have seen very large declines in demand over the past year, and the trend appears to be accelerating. This is not simply happening in one specific geography. It appears to be happening in them all, and in particular, South America and Asia. As a reflection of crumbling demand, raw material prices have crashed. Items such as oil, steel, iron ore, cement, and natural gas are more than 50% below their 10-year highs, measured in dollars. The leaders I've spoken to inside and outside of my industry are all expressing alarm, and the vast majority of them can't really piece it all together and understand what lies at the root of the problem. Most are concerned about year-over-year earnings. After all, shareholders have become accustomed to strong and steady earnings growth. Some are even concerned about solvency. After all, when debt service payments are high, revenue needs to be much higher to pay the debt and still have enough left over to cover maintenance of building, ground, plant and equipment, and still make payroll. Which is one of the reasons why so many companies have had significant layoffs recently, and will likely continue to lay off more over the coming year. If you're in a position where you've lost your job, you have my deepest condolences. Believe me, almost all managers that I've known die a little on the inside when they're instructed to reduce headcount. You probably don't know this about your management team, but many of them care deeply about you. They are in a position where they have to bottle up their emotions when bad situations arise, but most of them are good people who work very hard to keep their people employed. So, if you're still employed, you might think about thanking your manager sometime. I bet he or she could probably really use a message of gratitude, especially right now. So how did we get here? What's really going on? I've made countless videos on the subject. Not everyone is going to have time to review them all, but they are all there for anyone who wants to. One in particular, the process of capital destruction, released a little over a year ago, talked about what I thought at the time was likely to happen in the fracking industry as a result of all of the capital investments being made and the fact that the debt would need to be serviced by continuing to pump ever-cheapening oil. Sure enough, the process set in place did its damage, and it is continuing to do damage. What we are likely getting started on a worldwide scale has at its core the same root cause. We should talk about that root cause because it is the key to understanding what lies ahead of us. What it really is a crisis of realization. But what do I mean by this? Let me explain by asking you to divide all of the items in the world into two categories: consumption goods and everything else. A consumption good is necessary for you to live your life, or it's something that you use simply because you enjoy it. In the process of using it, you destroy its value over a fairly short time span of a few years or less. Food is certainly an item that would fit into this category. Clothing would also fit into this category. Electronic devices, such as iPads or TVs, also fit, as does the gasoline that you use to fuel your car. Your car is also a consumption good because as you use it, it wears out quickly. Without frequent maintenance, it would be useless within the span of a few years at most. Even your house is a consumption good. Sure, it might last you a lifetime, but over that lifetime, things wear out and you'll need to end up spending significant funds to make repairs. Let's put everything else into another category: Items that don't really fit into the category of consumption goods are stocks, bonds, jewelry, art, gold, and silver, and land. And there are many other things that could fit into this category, but there are a whole host of items that people tend to own that are not really consumption goods. And these are items that people tend to amass. These are the things that people tend to store and count as their wealth. The reason? Because they can be held for a long period of time and sold later, so that consumption goods can be purchased with the proceeds. In other words, people hold these items because they believe these items can carry their purchasing power into the future. So we might call these things deferred consumption goods, or maybe wealth goods. In the past, people have used all of these items, some more successfully than others, for this very purpose. Now let's divide the world into two groups of people. On one side, we have people who are capable of producing. They are of working age and are in good health. Some of them have finely developed skills. Some have brilliant minds. Some simply have a good work ethic and a strong back. These are the people who produce consumption goods, and with the exception of land, they produce wealth goods as well. Then there are the non-producers. The non-producers consist mostly of people who are not yet of working age, and also of people who have spent a long career working and producing, but are no longer able to produce. Some are infirmed. Some simply feel like they've worked long enough and are ready to live off of the wealth that they amassed in the form of stocks, bonds, jewelry, gold, silver, art, and land. We know that regardless of what category people are in, producer or non-producer, all of them will require consumption goods. Thus, the producer group must be capable of producing enough for everyone. They produce an excess over and above what they need to consume or want to consume. The excess production will typically be used to buy some stocks, some bonds, jewelry, gold, silver, art, and land from the non-producer group. So we can see that we have a delicate balancing act. Consumption of the products of the producer class will exactly equal production. It cannot be any other way. If more consumption goods were made than needed, they would quickly wear out and become worthless. If fewer consumption goods were made, then people would simply need to do without. In order for this whole arrangement to work, at least on a voluntary basis, there is a certain amount of desire and faith required on the part of the producers. They have to value the wealth goods highly enough to motivate them to produce in excess of their immediate needs, and take wealth goods in trade for their excess production. They have to believe that producing more than they need is a worthwhile endeavor, and have faith that the wealth goods that they buy now will provide them with at least enough consumption goods later as they part with in the present. And they always have a choice of which type of wealth good that they want to take in exchange, ordinarily coming down to a decision of which one they think has the most promise of delivering to them a happy future. Every individual, whether producer or non-producer, has in his or her mind an idea of the value of these wealth goods. Each person will have a different opinion, and it is highly subjective. They will always be able to see items trading on the open market at certain prices. By referencing their own personal opinion of value against market prices, they determine how favorably valued various wealth items are priced, and thus the promise each has for preserving and building wealth in the future. These discrepancies are what makes for a market. Unfortunately for all those who hold any wealth asset, be it stocks, bonds, land, gold, silver, art, or what have you, there is really no precise way of knowing the value that a future generation of producers will place on any of these assets. The best that can be done is to estimate a value based upon a little math and some good rules of thumb. It is only when the wealth goods are used to obtain production goods that the truth is revealed. Each individual in a capitalist society takes it upon themselves to make sure that when the time comes, they have enough wealth assets to purchase the consumption goods that they will need, should they not be able to work. Sometimes individuals are quite successful in this endeavor. Sometimes they are quite unfortunate. It's usually shortly before the consumption goods are needed that the individual will know how well he or she has done, which occasionally leads to a personal crisis if the market tells them that they were wrong in their opinions of value. This is a crisis of realization, where the individual realizes that their wealth assets are not worth what they thought they were. The crisis can come in many forms and flavors. Maybe the individual had a portfolio of stocks and found shortly before retirement age, after a significant market decline, that the pool of producers values his shares at half of what he thought they were worth. Argue as he might about the reasons why they should be more valuable, he only has one choice. Either take what's offered and live more simply, or delay retirement. Then there is the individual who bought bonds in the hopes that between interest and principal payments, her bond holdings could be used to fund a comfortable retirement. But then shortly before retirement, interest rates declined to be well below where she thought that they should be. Again, argue as she might that interest rates ought to be higher, she will eventually come to accept that she has no options but to accept what is offered. It will be a painful adjustment process, this crisis of realization, but it is an adjustment process that will eventually happen. Gold and silver buyers face the same issue. And what can happen on an individual level can also happen on a mass level. Let's talk briefly about the period of time leading to the Great Depression and the Great Depression itself. According to the historical record, from the year 1900 to 1929, the general price level of goods and services more than doubled. These 3 decades saw prices increase by about 2.5% per year. All of the while, we were on a gold standard. Those who held gold or cash outside of the banking system would have seen their savings devalued by 50% over the course of these 3 decades. Why is this? The government had set the value of the dollar in terms of gold and made dollars completely convertible. So why the decline in value? It all had to do with the expansion of credit. Between government borrowing to fund World War I, business borrowing to fund investment in plant and equipment, and personal borrowing to fund consumption, the supply of credit as measured by M2 money supply climbed from $10 billion to $65 billion. Whether the gold owner liked it or not, the newly created credit spent just like gold did, and all of the demand that it placed on consumption goods drove prices up. For the population of gold and cash holders, this was a crisis of sorts, and it should also serve as an illustration to those who want to stabilize prices by going back to a gold standard that gold alone will not do the trick. Somehow, a limit needs to be placed on credit creation. But after 1929, there was another crisis of realization. Those who had extended all of this credit came to realize that it could not possibly be honored. There simply was not enough specie in the banks to honor redemptions. This ultimately created a bank panic, which was really simply a crisis of realization on a mass basis. From 1929 to 1933, credit contracted by 30%, which was a 9% per year contraction. Prices declined by a similar amount, as those who held real money found out that they could buy much more than it could at the beginning of this period of time. So the turmoil around the Great Depression was really a crisis of realization. Those who had extended credit in the early 20th century in the hopes that the credit would serve as their wealth came to the realization, as the 1930s approached, that the credit was not worth what they had thought. And this created quite a panic. But would it be true to say that the credit went bad all of a sudden in the year 1929? No. The credit was bad when it was extended in the first place. What happened in the year 1929 was that the holders of the credit could no longer pretend that it was all good. Of course, those who had the power worked with the government and the Federal Reserve to preserve the illusion. When a bank holiday was declared, all of the gold called in, and the dollar redefined as 1/35th of an ounce of gold instead of 1/20th of an ounce of gold, it was like this picture of Dorian Gray, shown here, where a painting was used to capture and hide all of the flaws so that people could keep on pretending that the bonds were still worth what their owners had been pretending that they were worth. It's important to emphasize this once again. The credit was bad from the very beginning. Government and the Federal Reserve System were not able to prevent it from failing, nor were they able to ultimately force the bonds to be valuable. All they could do was move the consequences of the realization of failure from the rich to the masses. In other words, the losses were socialized. So what does this have to do with today? Well, we're facing the same crisis of realization on a much larger scale. I already discussed in another video the problem of the credit that was extended to the fracking industry for building all of the infrastructure needed to extract oil from rock formations. The credit was bad from the very beginning. Now we have an entire industry that must continue to produce more oil than the economy is prepared to absorb so that it can simply make interest payments on all of the debt that it took on. It has no hope of paying the principal payments that will be coming due on the bonds in a few years. The bonds themselves are not worth nearly what investors thought that they would be worth when they extended the credit in the first place. Just like in the shale industry, we have overinvestment in almost every other segment of the economy. Look at China with their very modern but underutilized highway system and cities that are barely occupied. There were those who wanted to lend them the capital to build all of that infrastructure. The extenders of the credit needed a place to store their wealth, and for a long time they enjoyed the illusion that they owned very valuable shares in businesses and bonds that would pay them handsomely over time. But the debt and equity offerings were dubious from the very beginning. The recent halting of the Chinese stock exchange twice in 1 week is a sign that confidence is starting to crack. There is a crisis of realization just beginning. And what of the U.S. stock market? It's declined by only 8% so far this year, and all I see are story after story explaining that there is no reason for the stock market to have declined by even this much. Truth be told, I'm surprised that the market has risen to the heights that it has. It is still 180% higher than it was when the true value of U.S. companies was almost realized in 2009. Because of the cheap cost of financing leading to stock buybacks, stocks are now more undercapitalized than they were in the year 2009. Revenues are falling, but debt loads are still very high. Yes, it is true that interest payments are lower than they were before, but just as is the case with the shale oil industry, there will be principal payments that will eventually need to be made. Unless somehow investors are willing to provide the necessary funds to allow these companies to roll their debt over when the principal comes due, there is likely going to be a very large string of bankruptcies. This will be bad for stock and bondholders alike. Sure, there may be those who want to keep the illusion alive. Perhaps some investors with lots of cash to burn will provide the funds needed for these companies to roll over the debt. Perhaps the funds will come from the Federal Reserve. Regardless, it will not make the credit good. All it will do is delay the crisis of realization. One of the biggest problems that we are facing right now is the plight of the baby boomers. An entire generation put their faith in Social Security, pension funds, stocks, and bonds. For a long time, Social Security took in more cash than it paid out. The government spent the money and created what it called a trust fund that it filled with treasury bonds. As more and more boomers have started to retire, the Social Security surplus has turned into a deficit, and the system is now starting to pay out more than it's taking in. As the entire generation of boomers enters retirement, will the funds be available to honor the obligations that were made? Only if there is a buyer for all the treasuries in the trust fund. Maybe the Federal Reserve will come to the rescue, but as Alan Greenspan admitted, the Federal Reserve can only help to make sure that the payments can be made in nominal terms. They cannot guarantee the purchasing power of the payments. This is simply an acknowledgement that in the real world, there have to be enough people working to create enough consumption goods to go around. It doesn't matter how much the savers think their savings should be worth. When all of the illusory wealth bids for real goods and services, we will find out just how much the savings are really worth, and the crisis of realization will be upon us. Pensions are in the same situation. For years, the regulatory agencies have allowed pension funds to assume an 8% return on the assets that they hold. Are 8% returns even possible in a world where interest rates on treasury bonds are only a couple of %? The short answer is no. As a consequence, the pension funds are in trouble. Kentucky, for example, is less than 20% funded. Will the pension funds be able to make good on their obligations? No. But that doesn't stop people from pretending in the meantime. Speaking of pretending, the regulatory agencies do not require the financial houses to mark their derivatives holdings to market. The balance sheets investors see are not even real. The executives of the financial companies are allowed to assign values to derivative investments, which are nothing but opinion. Nobody knows how much the derivatives books are really worth. It's a problem of huge magnitude, especially now that derivatives have been given seniority over other debt instruments and even deposits. So it's a problem of huge magnitude, and one where we know that we are pretending. We won't have a crisis of realization until someone calls on the derivatives holdings to perform. We've come close when small countries such as Greece and Puerto Rico were not able to honor their debts. Credit default obligations should have been triggered. However, you'll notice that the ISDA has done their best to avoid using language that would require these derivatives to perform. The problems that the global economy faces right now are all rooted in a single cause, and that is, for years, the excess production of the world has been used to bid up the price of wealth goods, mostly stocks and bonds. The value assigned to all of these wealth goods is a pretend number. We've been pretending for years that the mountain of debt and equities can be exercised to buy $300 trillion worth of goods and services. We've also pretended for years that the mountain of derivatives can be exercised to buy close to $1 quadrillion worth of goods and services. But we all know that this cannot be true. But that doesn't stop us from pretending. Fortunately, the illusion does not have to crack until those who own these assets decide that they want to try to cash in. That hasn't happened yet. But we do have an aging population, and those who are preparing to enter into the non-producer group will need to put food on the table, buy clothes, obtain medical help, and heat their homes. As this happens, we will get a chance to see the real Dorian Gray. And we will also see a world where the general living standards will not be what we've been pretending that they should be. Events are taking place that are interesting to observe. However, those who have watched the videos on this channel and understand the framework presented will recognize that the individual events are only part of a much bigger story that is playing out as it must. In other words, discussing the individual events themselves at this point will not add much to what's already here. I'll just mention the events now. Sit back and think on them in the bigger context of what I've discussed in my last video. General commodity prices have fallen. The Baltic Dry Index is at record lows. We've seen mass layoffs from many commodity-producing companies. High-yield debt is under stress and is selling at deep discounts on the secondary market. Credit default swaps on banks such as Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank are rising quickly as the stocks of many of the world's big banks start to succumb to selling pressure. Gold and silver are starting to rise as large tranches of gold are moved from the registered category to the eligible category on the COMEX. The new silver fix mechanism finds a price that is 6% below market, creating instant losses for anyone who was on the long side of silver options. The Bank of Japan announces negative interest rates shortly before Japan finds it needs to cancel its bond auction. Currencies are fluctuating against each other with wilder and wilder swings. Currencies in South America are devalued as many in their middle class start to find it difficult to make ends meet. Former boom areas such as North Dakota and Alberta find their unemployment rates skyrocket along with their rates of substance abuse and suicide. News stories start to appear about the need to move towards a cashless society. What are all these events? They are simply bits and pieces of a big story. Think of them as falling snowflakes or blowing leaves on a shortened day in late November. For anyone who knows that winter is approaching, none of it should come as a surprise. Build yourself a fire. Sit down with a good book. Pour yourself a glass of bourbon. And as the band Tool suggests in their song Disposition, watch the weather change. Sometimes it's good just to sit back and watch as the future is revealed to us. And by the way, I was tempted to overlay Disposition as I mentioned each one of these recent events, but I didn't want to be flagged by YouTube for copyright violation. If you want to experience what I just said the way that it had played out in my head, please play Tool's Disposition at low volume and replay the first part of this video. So what is this video going to be about? Well, a subscriber posted a question which I thought would be a good topic for discussion. He wrote in regards to gold. Okay, I realize this is a silly argument, and I don't want to bash any of the economists that have openly been discussing this notion in the blogosphere, but which is it? A commodity or a store of value? I think we can all testify to the manipulation in numerous techniques, psychological, statistical, futures, MSMs, and this due to the various administrative entities that need the dollar to be the store of value. Economics 101, it has no other use. This is what it does. On the other side of the debate, Harry Dent theory, it is acting uniformly to the other PMs and base metals. In my eyes, this shift, conditioning, in the perspective of gold and the dollar, be it true or false, is at the very foundation of market action in both. Don't worry, I won't be offended if you bash Harry a little. What is your perspective on this debate, and can you give us your premises for your conclusion? Maybe I'm trying to entice you into another vid. Okay, fair enough, and it's a good topic. Let's discuss it. Just as in my last video, I won't need charts. All I will offer this time are words. The charts are all there in my older videos for those who want to find them. Most will be in the playlist titled Why Gold and Silver Are Monetary Assets and Not Mere Commodities. We'll start with the definition of commodity from the Cambridge English Dictionary. It reads, a substance or product that can be traded, bought, and sold. That's a rather broad definition, don't you think? According to that definition, a politician would be a commodity. Sorry about that last joke. I meant no offense to the other commodities of the world that do not have the privilege of holding high office. Gold is certainly a substance. After it is refined and formed into bars, coin, or jewelry, it's also a product. It can also be traded, bought, and sold. Thus, by the definition given by the Cambridge English Dictionary, it is a commodity. This is strictly correct, according to the definition, and I will not argue that this is true. Just the same, calling gold a commodity and assuming that it has the same qualities and follows the same rules as all other commodities is rather dismissive. I suppose if I made my living selling financial products to the masses, I'd be tempted to stop here. I might even be tempted to make a flippant comment about gold being a pet rock, but doing so would not be intellectually honest. So let's go a little deeper. Gold, like all other commodities, is certainly a substance. Let's compare and contrast gold against other substances. All substances are either pure elements or combinations of elements. Very few substances are found in elemental form because most elements are reactive and tend, at least over geologic timescales, to combine with other elements. The chief exceptions to this rule are the noble gases on the right-hand side of the periodic table. These are helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon. All other elements, with the notable exceptions of gold and platinum, are reactive. Copper, silver, palladium, osmium, and rhodium can also be found in elemental form. They do tend to react slowly with oxygen and sulfur, but also tend to passivate, which means that once they react on the surface, the reaction tends to not penetrate any further. Most owners of silver have seen oxides form on their coins or bars. The non-reactive nature of gold and platinum and resistance to reaction of copper, silver, palladium, osmium, and rhodium make these metals rather useful from the standpoint of being low maintenance. A person who owned some of these metals and placed them in storage for years or even decades could be certain that they would not change much over time, thus being rather immutable. The same cannot be said for other elemental metals such as iron, which would tend to oxidize over time unless it was alloyed with quite a bit of chromium. Gold and platinum are unique because they will not fade, discolor, or change over time, even over long periods of time. They are almost made to be stored. Speaking of storage of gold and platinum, they are very, very easy to store. They are extremely dense, and one can easily store a high-value quantity of metal in a small space. A 1-ounce gold coin can be purchased for about $1,200 currently. This represents about 1 month worth of wages for a minimum wage earner. So one could envision having a pocket full of gold and it being valued at the equivalent of about a year's worth of minimum wage labor. Platinum is similar. The other native metals are also easy to store. Silver, for example, can store quite a bit of wealth in a small space. However, the same pocket full of silver would really only represent a couple of days' worth of minimum wage labor, at least at current prices. So gold is fairly unique in that it is non-reactive and very value dense, and there are a few substances outside of gemstones that share these qualities. Why is it so important that there are items that are value dense and durable? Well, let's suppose that you're a person who is a little skeptical of human nature and do not want to entrust your entire life savings to the custody of another. Being able to buy a durable and value-dense item is one way to avoid having to entrust your wealth to the stewardship of another person. It is also a great way to ensure privacy. Storing a high-value item such as gold yourself is a great way to ensure that nobody knows that you are a person of means. It is wealth that is non-discoverable in litigation, meaning that it won't be the target of frivolous lawsuits. And, in the event that your government becomes abusive, it can be kept in secret or even moved across borders easily, either personally or via courier. With no other substance other than gemstones and very rare metals, would it be easy to keep in secret $1 million worth of value, much less carry it with you. So gold is durable, private, and highly portable. What other aspects make it rather unique relative to other substances? Because of its history, it is highly recognizable. Go anywhere in the world, and you will find that even the most poorly educated know what gold is. They may not currently appreciate its value, as Mark Dice has often demonstrated, but they do know what it is. Ask someone about rhodium, or even platinum sometime, and you'll probably be greeted with a blank stare. As a side note, this is one of the reasons why, even though platinum is historically inexpensive relative to gold, I don't buy much of it. Now, recognizability is just about a person knowing what an item is. It is important that a person also be able to easily assay the item to determine its quality. Gold, because it's an element, has some well-documented properties that can be used to test its purity. If someone were to bring to me a quantity of gold to trade for something else, I would be able to fairly quickly test its Brinell hardness, its specific gravity, its reactivity, or its melting point if I had any doubt about its authenticity. And the less experienced among us could generally tell whether or not a gold coin was authentic by feeling the weight of it in the hand and by listening to the pitch of the ring resulting from pinging its edge. The same is not true for most other substances. For example, gemstones are very non-uniform, and it takes a very skilled and knowledgeable person to determine the quality of the stone. Other substances, such as bottles of vintage wine, also require quite a bit of skill, and thus will not be as easy to trade for services or other items of value. Generally, the sale of any high-value item that is not pure precious metal will involve high assay costs, so that the person who accepts them can be assured of their authenticity. Gold, being a metal, is also easily divided into smaller quantities without affecting its value. Fracture a gemstone, and the total weight of the shards will not be equal to the original value of the stone. Sure, one can argue that cutting an MS-64 1848 $10 Liberty Head gold coin in half would destroy its value. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is gold bullion. And I'm not saying this is an important thing for barter, although it certainly could be. The reason it's important is that it provides the person of modest means an opportunity that is also open to the wealthy. A person who holds a plain vanilla gold bullion 1-ounce gold coin will command roughly 1% of the wealth that the person who has a 100-ounce good delivery gold bar will command. The wealth contained in a massive gold bullion is proportional to its amount. Another reason why this is so important is that it allows a person to liquidate a fraction of his wealth holding. A person who holds a rental real estate property, for example, as his or her main wealth possession, will find that the entire property would need to be sold in order to access the equity in the house, assuming the person is averse to taking out a loan against the property. Contrast this to a 100-ounce pile of gold coins. This type of wealth holding can be liquidated in single coin increments. All of these properties I just mentioned, immutability, portability, recognizability, and divisibility, make gold a very unique substance amongst all the others. But we still haven't touched upon the primary reasons why gold has risen to the top of all the other substances as the store of value par excellence. The first and most obvious one is its rarity. Gold's abundance in the Earth's crust is about 3 parts per billion. That means that for every billion particles of other stuff that exists in the ground, about 3 of it is gold. Platinum is also quite rare at 4 parts per billion. Palladium is about 6 parts per billion, and silver is about 80 parts per billion. That's why these are called the precious metals. We can compare these concentrations against industrially important metals. Lead is present in the Earth's crust at about 10 parts per million. That's million with an M. Copper is 68 parts per million. Nickel, 90 parts per million. Iron, 50,000 parts per million. And aluminum is 80,000 parts per million. Now this does not mean that when gold is found, it is at a concentration of 3 parts per billion. It would be completely uneconomic to extract gold at that concentration. Gold is present in deep veins of ore, which are economic to process. The richest veins right now have gold concentrations in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 grams of gold per ton of ore. And those are the richest. The average grade processed by the world's operating mining companies is just over 1 gram of gold per ton. Now think about this for a minute. Gold, when averaged over the entire Earth's crust, is 3 parts per billion. And when veins of ore are found, the average ore grade is about 1 gram per ton. This means that gold veins are extremely rare, which means that the exploration costs involved in finding new and economic gold deposits are huge. On top of that, once the gold ore is found, about 1 ton of rock needs to be blasted, extracted, crushed, and processed to obtain 1 gram of gold. In other words, the 1-ounce gold coin that you have probably involved the processing of 31 tons of rock. In addition, the cost of producing that ounce also includes administrative burden, assay costs, minting costs, and taxes. It's a very expensive operation producing each incremental ounce of gold, and as more gold is produced, the grade of the remaining deposits goes down, making the production of future gold even more expensive. But the high cost of production is not the whole story. Gold has, throughout history, been one of the most desired and sought-after substances on Earth. Yet, since the mid-19th century, which is 1850 and beyond, the amount of gold produced on an annual basis only added at most 3% to the above-ground stock. This number has been gradually declining as ore grades have declined and discoveries have become less frequent. For the past few years, the amount of gold produced has only added somewhere between 1.5 to 2% to the roughly 5.5 billion ounce above-ground stock. This makes the total supply of gold extremely stable over time. Regardless how highly priced gold becomes relative to production costs, you simply will not find the gold stock doubling in a year's time. The same cannot be said, for example, of the M0 money supply. Nor does the same apply to most other substances, silver being the closest exception, where above-ground stocks probably stand at about 18 years' worth of production. Other commodities are produced in a more or less just-in-time manner. Copper, aluminum, iron ore, lead, and nickel are costly to store. They are produced and sold as quickly as possible, and so the total inventory of each tends to be less than 1 year worth of production. Gold and silver, by contrast, are held in hoards, both public and private, worldwide. Gold, because it tends to not be used in industry, has the highest above-ground stock relative to production, standing at about 60 years. Gold, as opposed to most other substances, has few uses other than jewelry. So why is it so widely held? Why is it valued so highly? The primary reason is that it is a luxury item. Why are Rolex watches so highly valued? They're no more useful than a good citizen wristwatch. The answer? The Rolex watch is a luxury item. Why do 3 bottles of Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1869 wine go for $700,000 at auction, even though the bottles will never be consumed? The answer? They're luxury items. And the funny thing about luxury items is that they can be valued arbitrarily highly, and the higher the price tag, the more people seem to desire them. For a more detailed discussion, please watch my video titled Utility versus Store of Value. And this is one of the primary reasons why the wealthy choose to own gold. Aside from it being a long-term family tradition, it's also a luxury item. And the fact that gold is divisible means that you can own something of the same quality as the rich, which is not so much the case for artwork or Chateau Lafite Rothschild wine or Rolex watches. Pretty cool, huh? But what evidence do we have that all of this gold is highly valued? Well, simply look at the market value of all of the 5.5 billion ounces of above-ground stock. It's currently worth $6.6 trillion, most of which is not coming to market at current prices. There is no flood of gold to the market. The current $1,200 is mostly dictated by the marginal supply hitting the market, which comes from the mines. The mining companies are the ones who are selling the gold. They don't require a price that's much above their current cost of production, simply because the mining industry is like any other industry. They exist to make a profit expressed in local currency. The gold in central bank vaults tends to stay in the global banking system. It tends to move from one central bank to another. You will never find a record of a central bank bringing their gold to a public auction. And the private hoards of gold also tend not to hit the market. This is something that the oil states discovered in the late 1970s. In that decade, the oil states lost confidence in the dollar, and they sought to cycle their dollar profits into gold by bidding for gold on the spot market. The increase in prices did not bring more gold to market. Quite the contrary, it made the supply of gold dry up. It only succeeded in raising prices to very high levels. The wealthy of the world, who already owned gold, knew what was happening and had no interest in parting with their gold at any price, especially if it meant taking in return paper scrip whose future was uncertain. It was only after the derivatives market in gold was established to allow the oil states to secure future gold supply from the mining industry that gold prices were brought back under control. This whole event in the late 1970s is evidence that the above-ground stock is very highly valued. A rising price will not coax it out onto the market. Quite the contrary, a rising price of gold simply signifies an uncertain future for the currency in which the gold is denominated, and the wealthy recognize this. The gold is wealth that they keep, not the wealth that they trade for profit. Now, that's not to say that they don't lend their gold for profit. I've described the process by which they do that in many of my videos. But they will only lend their gold if they are confident in the return of their gold. And it is interesting that so much registered gold was reclassified as eligible in the COMEX recently. This suggests that the faith in gold return is waning. Now back to my subscriber's original question. Is gold a commodity, or is it a store of value? My premise is that it is both. By definition, it is a commodity. However, to lump it in with all other commodities is intellectually dishonest. Unlike other commodities, it is very value dense. It is immutable. It is highly recognizable, and it's divisible. It can be used to secure wealth in a way that is immune from counterparty risk. It can be easily hidden, and it is highly portable. Above all else, it is a luxury item and can be valued very highly without bringing much new supply to market. It is not just a store of value, it is the best store of value. It is what will work when all else fails. History has shown us this, and the wealthy of the world know this to be true. So with all that said, relax. Take all of these recent events in the context of the bigger picture of the future that's unfolding before us. Ignore the distractions of commentators who only examine price movements and never dig deeper than that. Go build yourself a small fire. Relax with a nice glass of bourbon or wine. Hold one of your gold coins in your hand and ponder gold's disposition. And together, we'll watch the weather change. Ayn Rand once said, "Contradictions do not exist. Whenever you think you are facing a contradiction, check your premises. You will find that one of them is wrong." These are wise words, to be sure, and very applicable when it comes to analyzing the statements and actions of the powers that be. In my last video, I discussed the op-ed piece written by Larry Summers for the Washington Post, where he proposed an international agreement to stop producing currency in denominations greater than $50. He cited the reason being to curb terrorism and drug trafficking. But I then showed how the real reason has more to do with preventing a banking system failure should everyone lose faith in the banks and decide to withdraw cash. I drew some analogies between the large denomination cash notes of today and the gold of the old banking system, and showed that while the overissuance of gold-backed loans in the past led to the calling in of gold, the overissuance of Federal Reserve note loans in the present is necessarily leading to a calling in of the cash of today. I ended the video by pointing out that it was interesting that in the 1980s, many nations began programs of minting bullion coins. It seemed odd that sovereign nations would have an interest in preventing its citizens from storing wealth outside of the banking system, while at the same time providing an ideal means of doing so, and one which posed no danger to the solvency of the banking system. Thus, we have a bit of a contradiction, and so we should check our premises. If you haven't seen that video yet, you can click on this screen at any time and it will launch for you. This will be the first of a series of videos where I explore the origins of the bullion coins introduced in the 1980s, and the people that initiated these programs. I will start with the US because the information will be most easily obtained. I don't know if I'll get around to the other international bullion coin programs. We'll have to wait and see where my research leads. In this video, I'm going to discuss the Gold Commission of the early 1980s, which was put together to study the causes of the rampant inflation at the time and explore the proper role of gold in the monetary system. The report they issued is highly informative. In this video, I'm going to give a broad overview of their findings and recommendations, and in subsequent videos, I'll do a deeper dive of several of the subjects contained. The Gold Commission consisted of many individuals of diverse backgrounds from different organizations. Their job was to represent a wide range of interests and see if they could reach a consensus on the proper role of gold in the monetary system. In addition to convening for meetings, they also called upon many experts, not listed here, to provide their input. I've listed here on this slide the individuals who made up the commission and the organizations they represented. The organizations represented were the Federal Reserve, the executive branch of the federal government, the House of Representatives, the Senate, academia, and business. It's clear in the report that not all of them agreed on every issue, which is to be expected given their different backgrounds. However, they did manage to reach a quorum on many issues. Their common conclusions and their disagreements were all documented in the report, and so one can read the report and not only see the group's recommendations, but also read the dissenting views. It was all laid out in the open in the report for anyone who wants to go back and read it. Here is an overview of the subject matter contained in the report. The report discusses the economic backdrop, in other words, the economic conditions at the time, which included uncertainty, rapid monetary inflation, and a soaring U.S. national debt. It discussed the history of the role of gold in the U.S. monetary system, as well as times when we were on a bimetallic standard, and the evolution of the monetary system, which culminated in an abandonment of the discipline of gold. It discussed possible alternatives to a gold-based system, including inconvertible paper and a commodity-based system. When it came to the role of gold, many different aspects were discussed, including the conduct of the Treasury and the conduct of the Federal Reserve and the possible private sector response to such conduct. They discussed implications for foreign exchange rates and the settlement of the balance of payments for international trade. They considered the role of the International Monetary Fund. They also discussed and debated many legal challenges that could be made should the U.S. try to reintroduce gold to the monetary system. And they also discussed historic production trends in gold and how the equilibrium price of gold is established. Let's first take a look at what they said about the existing gold medallion program. It's interesting to note that the Gold and Silver Eagle programs were not the first ones to produce U.S. government-certified gold and silver products for its citizens. There was a law put on the books in 1978 during the Carter administration which permitted the Treasury to produce medallions made from gold to commemorate artists. It was intended to be a 5-year program, and the target was to sell a minimum of 1 million ounces of gold to the public. Sales of these medallions started in 1980, and so they were already being sold before the Gold Commission was convened. The intent of the program was not to make money for the Treasury. The medallions were sold directly through the post office at a markup less than 3% over the spot price of gold as determined on the COMEX. The markup was only to cover the cost of producing and marketing the medallions. Clearly, this was an effort designed to provide a means of private citizens to own certified physical gold. The question we have to ask ourselves is why, which is a subject that we'll be exploring. The Gold Commission's recommendation on this program was to enhance it. They recommended selling to authorized dealers so that a secondary market would be established for selling these medallions to others. In other words, the Commission wanted these medallions to be liquid and resaleable. They recommended that the Treasury maintain its modest markup, but they also acknowledged that the secondary retailers would need to add a markup of their own. They also recommended discontinuing the program once a gold bullion coin program was set up, which then brings us to their recommendations for a bullion coin program, which was not yet established. The members of the committee who supported the establishment of a gold bullion coin program had visions of how the public would benefit from such a program. Some thought that the public would treat the coins as investments, a means of storing wealth and possibly growing wealth over time. Others thought that the public might actually exchange these bullion coins for goods and services, thus making the coins a competing currency, which would put a check on the current monetary system and impose some discipline on it. Importantly, though, they thought it appropriate that the price of the coins float with the market and not be fixed. They wanted a free-floating gold price. They wanted physical gold, certified for weight and fineness, to find its use in a marketplace, and wanted the people to decide how best to use it. Still, the committee was pragmatic. They realized that there would be lots of implications to their recommendations. The Gold Commission had limited resources and only a year in which to complete their study, and so they recommended that Congress evaluate aspects of a gold coin program more thoroughly before proceeding to enact such a program. One of the major concerns was regarding the depletion of the Treasury gold stock. Many viewed the gold stock to be of primary strategic importance, which will be discussed in a minute, and they did not want a popular gold coin program to run down the U.S. gold stock. They proposed that Congress consider authorizing the Treasury to buy gold in the open market and from the mining industry to replace the gold used to make the coins. Those who saw gold as being adopted as money did not want to put a cap on the gold supply and thought that the Treasury stock should be fair game if adequate gold could not be sourced elsewhere. Keep this in the back of your head for a moment because I'll be discussing the actual Bullion Coin Act in a moment. Another implication that they thought should be studied further was the impact of a coin being given legal tender status. As is always the case when legal tender laws are changed, there are existing debtors and creditors in the system. The introduction of a new legal tender gives the debtor the choice of what is used to pay back debts, where there are no specific clauses built into the debt contract, and this opens the doors for the creditors to be screwed. They also suggested that the Treasury consider a capital gain exemption on price changes on the coins, but they acknowledged that this might detract from the desirability of other collectible items as investments. But those who saw gold as being used as money saw it as a key element of the program and wanted it considered. Another suggestion was that the Congress consider obligating the Treasury to buy back any and all coins that were offered to it for sale. Ultimately, the Commission made several rather concrete recommendations with regards to what to do with the bullion coin program. The first was that the coins be issued in specific weights. The Commission recommended not stamping a dollar value on the coins. This was consistent with their desire to allow the value of the coin to float with the market-determined price of gold, and was also aligned with the desire of some who wanted to see a competing currency system emerge. Consistent with the goal of serving the interests of the public and giving them a means of owning certified gold, the recommendation is that the Treasury continue to place a small markup on the coins so as to only cover the costs of producing them and marketing them. They saw the issue as important enough to recommend Congress put a law on the books for the production of these coins. And finally, they recommended that the coins be exempted from capital gains tax as well as state sales tax. And so with all that said, let's see which of these features were adopted as part of the Gold Bullion Coin Act of 1985. Here's a table I put together summarizing the recommendations of the Gold Commission on the left against the actual features of the Gold Bullion Coin Act on the right. Not surprisingly, the Bullion Coin Act did specify specific weights to be minted. Contrary to the recommendation of the committee, Congress did decide to stamp a dollar value onto the face of each coin. Technically, this made the coins legal tender. But at the same time, the dollar value they stamped on the coins was so low that nobody would decide to use the coins to discharge existing debt. I suppose choosing such a low dollar value also eliminated the potential of the gold coins being used preferentially to dollars to discharge debt should the market value of the gold drop below the face value stamped on the coin. That's just a speculation on my part. Still, one has to consider what was the motivation to put any dollar denomination on the coin at all, as opposed to just stamping it with a weight and a fineness. I'm hoping that my research on the subject uncovers an answer to that mystery. The Coin Act did specify that the markup be modest and large enough to cover production costs. And, As the committee recommended, the Bullion Coin Act was enacted by Congress and is part of the U.S. legal code. Congress did not exempt the coins from capital gains tax or state sales tax. What we do know, however, is that the current tax code treats the capital gains similarly to ordinary income, in that the percentage to be paid on capital gains is very low until you find yourself in one of the higher tax brackets. You can see some details by reviewing my video, The Mythical 28% Collectibles Tax. One very interesting bit of language included in the Gold Bullion Coin Act is that the gold eagles are considered to be numismatic. The Gold Commission did not recommend this, but the authors of the law must have thought it was important enough to include. For what reason, I'm not 100% sure. But I think there was some intention behind it, and I'm hoping to someday find an answer to this riddle. Finally, it's worth noting that the law was specific about the source of the gold. It specified that the gold was to be purchased from the mining industry and that the Treasury Secretary could authorize the use of the Treasury stock, but only if purchased gold was insufficient to meet demand. So we can see that the Gold Eagle and Silver Eagle programs were very carefully considered, and they took years to enact. But ultimately, laws were put in place to provide people with a means of obtaining physical gold and silver of certified weight and fineness at a cost that was only modestly above the market price of their underlying commodities. This does not seem to me to be the action of a bunch of parties who do not want people to have the option of protecting their wealth outside of the banking system. In any event, the Gold Commission had many more interesting topics that they covered. I'd like to talk about them at a high level now, because many of them are very illuminating about how the government treats gold now. The Commission studied and debated allowing the Treasury to sell gold-denominated bonds. Advocates saw this as a way of reintroducing gold to the monetary system, and also saw it as a way for the Treasury to reduce its interest costs on the debt. After all, if the investing community had a gold-backed bond, they would not need to be as concerned about inflation, and they would not demand as high an interest rate as was on the unbacked bonds of the early 80s. The advocates also saw that eventually this would be a means of driving down interest rates on the unbacked bonds, because the use of gold in the U.S. debt would require spending discipline, which would reduce deficit spending and thus reduce inflationary expectations. The detractors had some good points to make on this issue. They saw a problem with a gold-backed bond that paid interest. For one, it would provide the owner of the gold bond a risk-free means of taking delivery of gold in the future that was free of storage costs and came with an interest rate sweetener. If such a vehicle was available, then there would be very little reason to own physical gold, and thus it would defeat the purpose of making physical gold available to the public. And the last thing they wanted was for their recommended program to fail. They also worried about the bonds devolving into a vehicle used primarily by speculators as opposed to investors. In addition, they viewed it as not being of any advantage to the Treasury Department. Issuing gold-backed bonds when the investing public at large was willing to buy unbacked bonds would only introduce risk to the Treasury that it did not have to take. Ultimately, the recommendation of the committee was not to issue gold-backed bonds. I personally view this as a wise action. After all, it was the overissuance of gold-backed bank credit that led to the bank runs of the 1930s, and the overissuance of gold-backed debt and currency in the 50s and 60s that led to a run on the Treasury gold in the late 60s and early 70s. Gold's role is best served by not being involved in credit contracts. That's my personal opinion, not the expressed view of the Gold Commission. But let's now turn our attention to the fascinating topic of the U.S. gold stock. The content of the Commission report is very interesting when it comes to custody and storage. In 1982, the U.S. owned 264 million ounces of gold. The Commission report was very specific that the gold was the property of the Treasury and not the Federal Reserve. The majority of the gold was held in mint depositories, and a minor portion was held in custody of the New York Federal Reserve Branch. As of the writing of the Commission report, 80.5% of the Treasury stock had been audited, with the intention of auditing the rest by 1984. Some members of the committee were frustrated that it should take so long to audit the gold, but ultimately agreed that they were satisfied with the audit that had been conducted thus far, and that the U.S. was accurately representing the gold that it owned. Now, here's where the issue of custody becomes very interesting, and might be a reason why the audits take as long as they do. It's easy to verify that the gold bar exists, as it is in physical storage. It's a little less easy to determine whether or not the gold bar is legitimately owned by a particular entity. Let's talk about the gold certificates mentioned in the Gold Commission report. The gold certificates are considered liabilities of the Treasury, and they show up on the asset side of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. They are on the books at $42.22 per ounce. What the Commission report says is that the gold certificates are issued by the Treasury as an obligation against its gold holdings. In exchange for these gold certificates, again valued at $42.22 per ounce, the Federal Reserve creates a dollar credit in the name of the Treasury on the liability side of its balance sheet. When I say dollar here, I mean Federal Reserve notes. So in a sense, the gold is the physical property of the Treasury, but it's encumbered. It's like owning your home, but having a mortgage against it. Yes, technically you own the home, but you are not free to do anything you want with it. For example, you cannot sell your home without discharging the mortgage. Such it is with the Treasury gold. The Commission report stated that all of the Treasury gold had been monetized in this fashion. It had been converted to Federal Reserve notes that are backed by gold certificates issued by the Treasury. So in a way, the Federal Reserve notes in circulation are backed by gold as an obligation of the Treasury. The Commission report said some very interesting things about the rules associated with this arrangement. Apparently, new gold certificates can only be issued by the Treasury if the statutory price, currently at $42.22 an ounce, is increased. In other words, if the Treasury increases the book value of its gold, it can monetize the increase and obtain Federal Reserve notes in exchange. With such an easy means of closing a funding gap, one would have to wonder why such simple measures were not taken by the Treasury during recent budget crises. It turns out that the answer is pretty straightforward, as we'll see in a minute. The other interesting thing to note is that if the U.S. were to sell its gold, it would require the retirement of existing gold certificates, with a corresponding reduction in the Treasury account at the Fed. Such an action would retire the gold certificates, but would also reduce the base money supply in the banking system. One can see, though, the similarities between this arrangement and a mortgage. The U.S. cannot sell its gold without paying off the obligations held against it. Now, this report was written in the early 1980s. Let's see if what they described still holds true today. I've taken a couple snapshots here. The one on the top is from the Department of Treasury and is an accounting of its gold reserve. Notice that Treasury states on its book that it owns 261 million ounces of gold and carries them at a book value of roughly $11 billion. This is because of the current practice of booking the gold at $42.22 an ounce. The picture on the bottom is a snapshot I took of the Federal Reserve balance sheet at the end of last year. Notice that it lists $11 billion worth of gold certificates held as collateral against Federal Reserve notes. This is the same $11 billion worth of gold the Treasury shows in its holdings. This is not double counting the same asset. The Federal Reserve shows an offsetting liability on its balance sheet for the Federal Reserve notes that it has on deposit in the name of the Treasury that were created when the gold certificates were printed for the Federal Reserve by the Treasury. Now, on the surface, this whole arrangement would look quite shocking and lead one to conclude that the Federal Reserve had cornered all of the U.S. gold stock and owns it indirectly. This is the stuff of dreams for a person who enjoys a good conspiracy theory. Let's dig a little deeper and find out how this arrangement came about. Let's go back to the executive order signed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1934. Remember, this was the action taken by the president as a result of the banking crisis of the early 1930s. The problem was that so much gold-denominated debt was built up as a result of risky loans that when some of the banks got into trouble, creditors worried about whether or not their claims on gold were any good, and thus there was a run on the banks. The problem with a run on a centralized banking system, aside from the obvious one of complete systemic failure, is that if you are the first in line, you get your money. If you are the last in line, you get nothing. It has nothing to do with fair or unfair. It only has to do with how quickly you recognize the problem and act upon it. Thus, the saying goes that you don't want to be the guy who starts a bank run, but once one is started, you sure don't want to be late to get in line. So anyway, Roosevelt needed a way to prevent a complete disorderly collapse of the country's monetary system, and at the same time needed a way to make sure that a large segment of the population wasn't completely wiped out. After all, the people in the front of the lines were more likely to be the financial insiders who were partially to blame for the crisis, leaving the mom and pops of the world to be left as the last in line. I know there are a lot of strong feelings about Roosevelt's action, but let's set those feelings aside for a moment and see what was done, and then we can make some judgments. Here are some excerpts from the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. I'm not going to read it now, you can do that for yourself, but here's what it says in a nutshell. Basically, Roosevelt is saying to the Federal Reserve, and so is Congress, you guys are irresponsible jerks for creating all of these risky loans. You have put the entire monetary system of this country at risk. You obviously cannot be trusted. So what we are going to do is take all of the gold that you use as an asset base, and we're going to hold it in trust. In return, we are going to give you gold certificates to serve as your monetary base. This way, we will know that the gold exists, exactly how much of it exists, and where it is. Oh, and by the way, from now on, you have to hold a 35% reserve of these gold certificates against deposit accounts, just as our way of making sure that you don't overextend credit again. Anyway, that's my interpretation of what was said in this act, so let's see how it affected the Federal Reserve at the time. Here's an excerpt from the Federal Reserve Bulletin